Welcome to the November program of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. And happy Veterans Day to all of you veterans, and for all Americans, thank goodness for liberty, right? Well, listen, we're going to get started, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Connie Harris. This is the Harold Deutsch lecture every November. She'll explain what it is and introduce our speaker. Thanks, Connie.
I suppose I could begin this with Once Upon a Time, but that would just be a fairy tale, and this is history, so it's real. But once upon a time, Don Patton met up with Dr. Harold C. Deutsch at a Perkins, and they hatched a plan to start up a World War II history roundtable. They based their model on the Civil War roundtables that have been around for years. As you know, Dr. Harold Deutsch was a very popular professor at the University of Minnesota. But during the war, he was also a member of the Research and Analysis Division of the OSS. And at the end of the war, he was loaned out to the State Department to interrogate German leaders at Nuremberg. Deutsch was uniquely qualified for this since he was fluent in German and conducted interviews of German leaders during his sabbatical years from the university in Germany in 1936 and 1938. I've written on this an article myself on this, and hopefully it's going to be part of a book on Harold Deutsch that I'm writing. The people he interviewed were well known if you've studied anything on the European theater, World War II. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, General of Artillery Walter Warlimont, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, and his focus during the interviews were on German foreign policy. And he did not present himself as part of the prosecution team. He was just a historian interested in getting the facts straight, which made these gentlemen less hesitant to speak with him. And again, his fluency in German did not hurt either. He also was if any of you had the privilege of meeting Harold Deutsch, he was a very charming man, and he was able to charm his way to getting these folks to speak. After the war, these interviews provided part of the narrative of his major works, The Conspiracy Against Hitler and the Twilight War, and Hitler and His Generals. And this also became part of his classroom lectures at the University of Minnesota and at the Army War College, where he happened to meet a guy named Don Patton. Now, the people that Deutsch interviewed were part of the main trial at Nuremberg. And tonight's presentation by Michael Bayzler, Professor Michael Bayzler, will be on the other trials that didn't get as much attention as that main one. Talking with Dr. Michael Bayzler this afternoon, I found out that he does have a Minnesota connection. He wanted me to make sure to mention this in my introduction. His family immigrated to the United States from Poland in 1964, and they first settled in North Minneapolis, where he became a lifelong Minnesota Twins fan. And much like myself, he grew up on the baseball exploits of Harmon Killebrew and Tony Oliva. And still, you must have cheered for the 2 World Series victories in '87 and 1991. Now let us pause for a moment to remember those blessed times. Oh, so wonderful. But besides being a Twins fan, Professor Bayzler is a professor of law and the 1939 Club Law Scholar in Holocaust and Human Rights Studies at Chapman University School of Law in Orange, California. And he is the author of numerous books and articles, too many to count, and especially like the ones that Axel mentioned earlier. Please check those out. Having had to write the round tablet, I had to read these, and this is a very good book. Now that I've done the plug for sales and his royalties, I will now let him get started with his presentation. Thank you.
I want to thank very much Connie for that very nice introduction. And also my great thanks to a colonel who brought me here. Thank you so much, Don. I'm so grateful to be here. As Don knows, I love coming to Minnesota. I feel like since I became an American here, that this is really my hometown. And people ask me, what is your hometown? I say, Minneapolis. Okay? So I am coming back to my hometown. And to be able to come here in November 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, we are about 8 days away from the actual day when the trial started, which is November 20th, 1945. And so to be here and to talk a little bit about it and to talk about the other trials, I'm really honored to do so. So let me begin with my presentation because I want to go ahead and introduce you. I'll talk a little bit about Nuremberg, but I do want to discuss the trials that are mentioned in my book. As you see, I have a co-author here, Frank Turkheimer, and he's like you, a Midwesterner. Frank taught for many, many years at University of Wisconsin Law School, and he taught a class on war crime trials, and I teach a course at my law school on war crime trials in World War II. And so we decided to collaborate together and to put a book together discussing what we call the forgotten trials of the Holocaust. Trials of Nazi war criminals that people don't know about, that even historians don't know about. And you'll see that some of these trials that in this book we cover from period of 1943 to 1999, and we cover countries all over the world, in Europe, in Israel, in the United States, in London, in Germany, and to sort of show the large picture of what the prosecutions were of Nazi war criminals, including prosecutions that occurred that are still going on today. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But I want to set the setting for you with an introduction about, and kind of put you back to what the Germans at that time called Stunde Null, which is 0 hour. Think of what it represented. And Stunde Null came on midnight, May 8th, 1945, with the capitulation of the Nazi forces high command, and it came in effect at midnight, marking the end of World War II in Europe. And what did Europe confront at the 0 hour? Political scientist R.J. Rummel, in his now classic Death by Government, emphasizes, and I'm quoting now, that the Nazis murdered from between 15 million to over 31 million people, most likely closer to 21 million men, women, handicapped, aged, sick, prisoners of war, forced laborers, camp inmates, critics, homosexuals, Jews, Slavs, Serbs, Italians, Poles, Frenchmen, Ukrainians, and so on. End of quote. Europe laid in ruins, with entire cities decimated, and 8 million people homeless, displaced, most of them hungry, looking daily for food. The figure usually cited for the number of Jews murdered by the Nazis and their supporters is 6 million. Let me put this in context. In 1939, the Jewish population of Europe was 9.5 million people. Only 3.5 million survived. In 2015, 70 years later, the worldwide Jewish population stands at 14.2 million, which is less than the 16.6 million Jews that were alive in 1939. So you can see 7 years later, the population of Jews worldwide is still smaller today than it was in 1939 as a result of the acts of the Nazis and their collaborators. Estimates for the other persecuted groups are between 90 to 200,000 Roma and Sinti, commonly known as Gypsies, between 200 and 300,000 people with disabilities, between 5 to 10,000 gay men, approximately 2,500 Jehovah's Witnesses. Other large-scale victims of the Nazi killing machine include over 3 million Soviet POWs, approximately 1 to 1.5 million political dissidents. The death toll and destruction caused by the Nazis and their collaborators during their 12-year reign was unprecedented in human history. So now the question that the Allies had is what to do with the surviving Nazi leaders. We started off with May 1945, a month before Hitler died. He committed suicide. A number of his associates also committed suicide. Some escaped. As you know, Eichmann escaped to Argentina. But there were some that were caught and some that voluntarily surrendered. And the talk began even before the war ended as to what to do with those individuals. And so when the Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill got together, they began talking about the plans. And the plan that Stalin came up with is he said, the plan that Churchill came up with said, look, let's consider these individuals to be criminals. This is the Nazi high command. Let's pick out 5,000 of the leading Nazis, and that could have included Hitler if they had been captured. Saddam Hussein was captured. Why not, Hitler? And let's have what is called a drumbeat court-martial, which is a hearing in the morning and then a firing squad in the afternoon. Stalin thought that was a grand idea, except his number was 50,000. And he also said, but the way we do it in our country, we just don't put them to death. We actually have a trial. And these are the Stalinist show trials, where basically it's theater. Everybody knows what role they're going to play. At the end, everybody's going to get convicted and everybody confesses. Roosevelt was on the fence. He didn't know where he was going to go. And there was pressure by his cabinet officers, some who wanted the Churchill solution, others who said, no, if we end up doing that, we'll be just like the Nazis. We have to look at the law, and we have to use the legal system and put these individuals on trial. Now, at the end of World War I, the Allies tried that. But what they did is they allowed the Germans to go ahead and try their own. And that was a complete failure, because the Germans were forced to do so. They held trials. They ended up establishing some important international law, like war crimes, that individuals that were submarine captains in World War I that shot at civilian ships were found guilty by German courts of committing war crimes. But these individuals served very short sentences, and they were, allowed to basically escape from jail. So that was not going to be seen as a solution, having Germans try their own. And so the idea that the Americans came up with is to have an international trial, never been done before in human history, using not German law or Polish law or Russian law, but international law to put these individuals on trial. And it was the idea of having a trial, an American-style due process trial, is the idea that actually came about, and it was really the Americans that were the prime movers of that. When you put something like this from scratch, there's a lot of work that has to be done, from deciding where you're going to have it, to what kind of legal system are you going to use, and who are going to be the defendants you're going to put in the dock. So this is what history tells us, what actually occurred. The Americans took the lead. Roosevelt died. Truman succeeded him. And in May 1945, he asked a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court, Justice Jackson, to take a leave of absence to come and be the chief prosecutor in Nuremberg, or in Germany. And Jackson had been Roosevelt's attorney general before Roosevelt appointed him to the Supreme Court. And Jackson thought, great, I'll go there for the summer, during the summer recess. I'll come back by October 1st, the first Monday in October, and we'll be done with this. It'll be short. He underestimated greatly how much this would take. But he took the job, and has never been done before, never after have you had a sitting justice take a leave of absence and done that. So Jackson ended up doing that. I have to tell you that one of the things that he liked is wearing bow ties. So in his honor, when I go ahead and speak, I always wear a bow tie. And I'm going to read you part of his opening statement because I very much try to channel Justice Jackson as I go ahead and I make this presentation. But he really was a prime mover of this. And he ended up getting together the leading lawyers from the other Allied countries, the French and the British and the Soviets. They got together in London in June, and they put together what was called the London Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, by which these individuals, top Nazi leaders, are going to be tried under international law. What does that mean, international law? Well, they were put on trial. The easiest crime they could be put on trial for is war crimes. There's precedent for that. War is not a free-for-all. Individuals, military people, those of you in the military, you know this, that there are legal orders. And if you commit a war crime, such as summarily shooting POWs or going ahead and killing civilians, that is considered to be a war crime. And that was not a hard crime to prosecute. There was lots of precedent for that. But Jackson and his cohorts didn't want to stop there. They also wanted to try the Nazi leaders for the crime of waging aggressive war, what is called the crimes against peace. And that was considered to be the supreme crime, the crime from which all other crimes flow, said the Nuremberg judgment at the end. And then they ended up having a crime called crimes against humanity. What is that? It's sort of the precursor to the crime of genocide, which everyone knows, but there was no crime of genocide. The word itself was just invented the year before, 1944, by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who actually went to Nuremberg to try to convince him to use the word genocide during the trials, and they did, but it was used as a descriptive term. It wasn't used as a term of, a particular crime. And also the crime which American lawyers know about, all of you must know about, the crime of conspiracy. That these individuals, got together just like the mafia got together. And they had a plan, and the plan was to commit a crime under international law, the waging of aggressive war, and they'll be tried as international criminals. Now, Hitler wasn't alive. Himmler was no longer alive. He committed suicide after captured by the British. Other Goebbels committed suicide. Hermann Goering, who was the #2 guy and also the head of the Air Force, gave up. He ended up surrendering, and he thought, fine, the war is over and everybody shakes hands and we go on our merry ways. And he thought that the Americans were really going to treat him well because now the threat was the Soviets. He was very much surprised when he was arrested and he was sent to Nuremberg. Nuremberg was chosen by Justice Jackson because it was in the American zone. It was in Bavaria. And in Bavaria, in Nuremberg, there stood a courthouse that still exists today called the Palace of Justice. And they used one of the courtrooms there, Courtroom 600, where the trials took place. So let me take you now to Courtroom 600. Here we are, okay?
Slide
now,
two.
The trial began on November 20th, 1945, so 8 days from now. You see the 70 years. And the indictments were read to the 21 defendants that were there. Goering was the prime defendant. You can see the doctor there. And Goering is sitting in, actually he was sitting in the first row, but you see over here, he's the one being questioned on the stand during the cross-examination in 1946. And then Justice Jackson there is questioning him. And you see the other defendants sitting over on the dock. But this is how the courtroom looked like. You can actually go to Nuremberg and you can visit this courtroom, and there's a museum to the trials. They opened just a few years ago up on the top floor. So really this is, for us as lawyers, this is our Jerusalem. This is our Mecca, our Medina. That if you're supposed to make a pilgrimage sometime in your lifetime as a lawyer, I tell my students, you need to go to Germany and make a pilgrimage to Nuremberg in Courtroom 600. So for those of you that are law students or would-be students, law students, you need to make that pilgrimage, okay? I very much ask you to do that. So Jackson, on November 21st, went ahead and he read his opening statement. And this is the beginning of it. So this is on November 21st, 1945, him standing at that podium. You see the judges over there, and there were 4 judges and 4 alternates. An American judge, a Soviet judge, a British judge, and a French judge. And because this was an American show, we didn't want, the Americans didn't want to like seem that everything was American, so they asked the British judge, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, to be the presiding judge. And he agreed, and he was very good. He had good control of the courtroom. So during the indictment, when Goering went up and he pled not guilty, he wanted to make a speech. And Justice Lawrence cut him off and said, no, this is not time for speeches. Either plead guilty or not guilty. And on that day, you heard 2 words being said 21 times. And I jokingly say that these are my 2 favorite words in German. Nicht schuldig, not guilty. They all pled not guilty to these 4 crimes that I mentioned. And then Justice Jackson went up and he gave his opening statement.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
And this comes, you know, I get goose pimples when I read this part.
That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
These are very powerful words. This is one of the most best opening statements given in any trial in world history. Okay? You can go on today, 21st century, on YouTube, and you can hear Justice Jackson give that statement. You can see photos of him in his bow tie. I don't look like him at all, but you will see what a wonderful job that he ended up doing. So the trial started, as I said, in November 20th. It went just like any trial. You had the prosecutors put on their case. They then rested. In March 1946, the defendants were they allowed to take the stand, and Hermann Göring actually took the stand. And this was the big, couple of days when he took the stand, because the gallery was then filled, and they were going to see the squaring off between Justice Jackson and the cross-examination of Hermann Göring. And basically, this was a trial by documents, because as Jackson said, the Germans, and I'm saying it in a neutral way, were very good record keepers. But he said, how could they be so stupid to write down all the horrible things that they did? And so imagine, Hermann Göring is presented with documents, that he signed, showing that these are acts that he committed that are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy, and war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy, and crimes against peace, the most important one. Thank you so much. Okay. And so the trial ended on at the beginning of September. The judges then went to deliberate, and deliberated, and they said on September 30th, they're going to come back and announce their verdicts. In fact, over a period of 2 days, on September 30th and October 1st, 1946, they in turn read the judgments. Again, you can go on Google and YouTube, and you can read the judgments. But we know that this was a fair trial. This was not a Stalinist show trial. Because imagine, on that dock sat 21 defendants who were the highest ranking Nazis. And the judges found 3 of them to be not guilty, meaning that the prosecution did not provide sufficient evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that those 3 individuals were guilty of the crimes that they were charged. And those individuals walked out free. A number of those individuals were found guilty, and the sentence was capital punishment. A number of them received sentences of long prison terms. Goering received a death sentence, and he cheated the hangman. Someone slipped him a cyanide capsule, and he ended up taking that capsule the day before or the night before he was going to be executed. And he wrote a note saying that if you had put me before a firing squad as a soldier, I would let you do that. But you are hanging me as a common criminal, okay? And I'm not going to let you do that, and that's where I'm taking my own life. And these individuals were common criminals, because what Justice Jackson said in the rest of his statement, that no matter how high an individual is, what kind of position they hold in the government, they are not immune. There's no immunity. There's no impunity. You can be found guilty of international crimes. You can see this as the pillar of international law that is with us today, that began in Nuremberg. The trial ended as an ad hoc tribunal. It finished up, and the judges went home. The Americans then continued and held 12 trials later on. And I'll talk about one of these, or a few of these forgotten trials that took place in that same Palace of Justice, in Courtroom 600, and in other courtrooms in that courthouse. And those trials started in 1946, and they ended in 1948. For these trials, American judges, including a judge from Minnesota, Judge Christensen, who came out and who sat in 3-judge tribunals and used the same principles of Nuremberg to try these individuals. There were 12 trials divided into categories. So the first one was the was the medical trial of the doctors who committed these gruesome medical experiments on civilians and on prisoners of war. And there was a trial of the jurist. You might have seen the movie, fictional account, Judgment of Nuremberg, with Spencer Tracy playing the American judge. That was the jurist trial that happened. There was the high command trial of the generals. These were all done before American judges using international law, and those trials ended in 1948. And then people just think of, if they know about Nuremberg, they think about the main trial with Goering. Some know about the later 12 trials. And then people know also about the Eichmann trial, which I'll mention in a moment, which occurred in the 1960s. But there was much more than that. Because what happened is that as the Allied troops came into Germany and liberated these various camps, and this is one of the liberation photographs that you had, they end up finding on the side of the camps the prisoners who now were liberated, and the perpetrators who did not run away, or the perpetrators who were caught. And so each of the allies divided Germany into the 4 zones, ended up having trials in their 4 zones before their commissions. So Americans had it in the military commissions. And the trial that, the series of trials that took place during that time by the Americans was in the concentration camp Dachau. Dachau was the first, it's a camp outside of Munich. It was the first camp the Nazis had set up. And when the American soldiers came, they were aghast what they saw. Let me read you from the book, and because we talk about the Dachau trials, and this is what one observer described at the time. If ever the American soldier needed confirmation of the reasons why he was in uniform, why he was at war, why he was required to put his life on the line the day after day, enduring all hardships and discomfort and danger, it was contained in these 39 railroad cars that the Americans first encountered as they entered Dachau, even before they saw the prisoners. Here was the very embodiment of the evil Nazi regime that he had sworn to vanquish. As they cautiously approached, the familiar sickening stench of death greeted them. In each railroad car were piles of rotting human corpses, a total of 2,310 men, women, and children, to be exact, either totally naked or partially clad in blue and white striped concentration camp uniforms. So these were the dead people that they encountered, the corpses, and then they encountered these individuals who did not die off. So what the Americans did is they created a war crimes unit, the judge advocate section, on the grounds of Dachau in order to have these trials. And so American soldiers who had a legal education were then requisitioned to now try these individuals in these Dachau trials for the atrocities committed at Dachau and other concentration camps that the Americans had captured these individuals. Here's another photograph. See that Dachau detachment, War Crimes Group, Judge Advocate Division, of the U.S. Army, United States Forces European Theater. And you can see this spiffy young woman I think she's coming out, she's posing for that photo. The American military soldiers, they're wearing the kind of caps that they wore during the Nuremberg trial, which are kind of the helmets, which are, part of the blue helmets that the United Nations troops wear. So it began over there.
Next slide.
And these are the judges. These are the American military soldiers, officers, who are trying these individuals. Do you see the camp stenographer, court stenographer, that's taken down? And then you had the various individuals that were put on trial.
Like a prisoner with a sign in front of
these
them.
trials went very quickly. This was summary justice. It was not like Nuremberg where it took 11 months. They finished these trials within a matter of a few months with about 20-something individuals on the dock. And you can imagine it was very difficult to point out the specific acts. What helped is that the perpetrators were right there and the victims and witnesses were right there. So literally they could just point right there and say, this is the person that did so-and-so. You can see that? And it just so happened. So this is Franz Koppler, who was a commandant of one of the camps. And this is a photo taken right before his execution. He was found guilty by the military commission as Dachau here, and then a photo was taken right before he's going to be executed. Now, the British did the same thing.
Ravensbrück.
One of the camps that the British liberated was the Ravensbrück camp. And we talk about in a book about the Ravensbrück trials. And this is the British counterpart to what the Americans did. So on the grounds of Ravensbrück, which is a concentration camp set out not far from Berlin, became the largest prison in human history for women. There were thousands of women that were imprisoned over there. Some were celebrities. The sister of the New York mayor LaGuardia, I don't know if you know, he had a Jewish mother. And so the sister ended up marrying a Hungarian man and then stuck in Europe, and she was arrested by the Nazis, and kind of as a celebrity prisoner, she was sent over to Ravensbrück. The niece of Charles de Gaulle was arrested in France, and she was there. So the individual celebrity prisoners were treated okay, but it was a horrible place. It was a place where people were abused. The individuals were treated very badly. This is a book that came out last year. It made the New York Times bestseller list by Sarah Helm, Life and Death in Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women. So you can see it's still an untold story of what happened there. And Sarah Helm, in her very good book, tells about what happened to Ravensbrück. One of the interesting things about Ravensbrück is not just that the majority of the victims were women, but the majority of the guards were also women. And so those individuals were also put on trial by the British in Ravensbrück, and the women concentration camp guards in Auschwitz and other places all had their training in Ravensbrück. This is where they became the dog handlers, and they're very brutal people. And they were put on trial.
Next
So
slide.
this is during the course of the trial,
A woman
one of the
being,
victims testifies,
something about her leg.
and you can see that the attorney is pointing to on her leg, showing the after effects of the gruesome medical experiments that were conducted on these women. These women were not Jewish. They were known as the rabbits of Ravensbrück. Most of them were Polish women that were sent over there. And they were tested on in order to determine if German soldiers during the war, if they suffered a wound or if they had, dropped in cold ice water, how long they could survive. And in order to test for these, determine the mortality of such individuals, these prisoners, these rabbits, human beings were put through these experiments. And so the individuals, the doctors who participated in these gruesome experiments, other individuals in the camp, they were put on trial. You
Next
can
slide.
see some of the defendants,
people
you can see
sitting
there were
with
so many of
numbers,
them
8, 9,
that
10.
they had numbers, so that they pointed out defendant number 8, defendant number 9. You see, some are women, some are men.
Next
And
slide.
you see here, these are the British defense attorneys who were there, who helped out. So they were given a trial by which they were prosecuted, but they also had counsel. And in fact, there was a professor of international law from London who came to testify as an expert witness for the defense, arguing that their trial somehow violated international law standards. These were extremely fair trials. In a sense, the British were more fair, gave more due process in Ravensbrück than the Americans did at Dachau. My opinion, I was able to actually find the actual records of these particular trials, and they really looked at the guilt and innocence of each of the defendants, and after they were found guilty, there was a supervising officer who would look through the records to see if the sentence should be affirmed. A number of these individuals were found guilty and given the death sentence. Another other ones went ahead and were given long prison terms. And again, these were trials by the British, and it was done pursuant to British law under what was called the royal warrant, which is the power that the monarch has, in order to establish courts, in order to try individuals. In Dachau, this was the U.S. military justice system that was being used in order to try individuals.
Next slide.
Now, I mentioned
guys,
about the trials
looking
that
over
the
a big
Americans
book.
did in Nuremberg. These were not the military trials. These were trials that used the principles of Nuremberg. When the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, ended in October 1946, the original plan was to have more international military tribunals. But because of the start of the Cold War and the lack of cooperation with the Soviets, that idea was abandoned by 1946, and trials were held in each of the respective zones. And I mentioned the Americans in Nuremberg held 12 trials. And one of those trials was trial number 9 of the so-called Einsatzgruppen trial. And this is the beginning, the first stage of the Holocaust. What do I mean by that? In 1941, when the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they ended up going into the Soviet cities, and they would take the Jewish population, they would segregate them, they would then order them to meet somewhere in the town square and take them outside and murder them one by one. This was not extermination by gas, this was extermination by bullet. And about 1 million Soviet Jews, men, women, and children were murdered that way. Imagine the perpetrator sees the victim, and it's done right there when they're shooting them in front of these pits. And these were called the Einsatzgruppen, Special Action Squads. I have a personal connection to that. My mom was born in 1926 in a little Ukrainian town called Slavuta. And when they heard that the Germans were coming, half of that village thought, aha, the Germans are liberators from like World War I. They're going to free us from communism. The other half of the village said, no, we're hearing rumors that they're now capturing and shooting Jews. So she was part of the group that ended up fleeing. They went on wagons and fled, and I grew up listening to her stories of watching the sky continually for the German planes strafing the civilians. She was lucky because on that wagon, and her parents, she was 15 years old, and their cow, they made it out to a railroad where they were without the cow, ended up going on a railroad and ended up going to Uzbekistan in the Far East, where I was born. My father was born in 1922. He was a Polish Jew, and he was the only one that survived from his family because he fled to Soviet-occupied Poland. And something very, very lucky happened to him. He was arrested by the Soviet secret police, and he was sent to Siberia and then saved his life. Because in 1941, when the Germans came, he would have been captured and he would have been dead. So in 1945, still as a Polish citizen, he was freed. He ended up going from very cold Siberia to a more temperate climate. Imagine going like from Minnesota to Florida, okay? And he ended up in Uzbekistan, Tashkent, where my mother was, and they met and married, and that's where I and my brother and sister were born. And because my father was still a Polish citizen, we emigrated in 1957 to Poland, to communist Poland. And then 1964, as refugees, like the Somalian refugees that you have here today, we came as refugees to Minneapolis, Minnesota, sponsored by the Jewish community here. So I'm so grateful to be here because but for the Jewish community of Minneapolis, I would not be an American. I would not know about Harmon Killebrew or Tony Oliva or Hershey bars or being able to speak with you today. So you can see what an honor it is for me to be here. But that's my personal story, how I came to be, and the personal connection to Ben Ferenc, who was the chief prosecutor. Ben was a low-level prosecutor. He was told by one of his investigators in Berlin, they had located the reports from the field sent by the generals of how many Jews they had murdered at those places. And he went to his boss, Telford Taylor, who succeeded Justice Jackson, and says, we know who these generals are. We have their documents. And Taylor said, we already have all these other trials put together. It was the doctor's trial, the high command trial. Ben, if you're going to do this, you got to do it yourself. Ben was 27 years old. He graduated from Harvard Law School. He had never tried a case in his life. And he was made the chief prosecutor of trial number 9. If you go on YouTube, you can see his opening statement in this trial where he talks about this killing by these individuals, and he says, and he uses the word genocide in that opening statement. Imagine what a wise man at age 27, he was able to do that. Ben is now, he's the last living Nuremberg prosecutor. He's 96 years old. I have to tell you that when I visited him last in Florida, we had a very nice time together. He gave me breakfast, but he also told me that he still does 100 push-ups every morning. So the very next morning when he came to wake me up, I said, Ben, have you done your push-ups yet? And he said, no. I said, can we do it? And he said, now? I said, now. So we both dropped down. I did 40 push-ups. He did 100. And I love telling that story, and I always tell Ben about that. So here he is, and I have to tell you that this is the photo that I sent into the publishers, and they chose that photo to be on the cover. Yeah? It wasn't my doing, and so it was fate to do that. I ended up showing this photo to a couple of people, and I said, what do you think that is? And he goes, well, I think it's like 2 German lawyers, and it's one of their assistants that's standing there. And it's not. These are the 2 German defense attorneys and Ben Ferenc, the American prosecutor, showing them the documents that he's about to use during that time. So this comes from the point of the trial. And the Einsatzgruppen were convicted. Many of them were put to death, including the star defendant, General Otto Allendorf, who admitted that his troops under his command murdered 90,000 Jewish men, women, and children. This is Ben
Next slide.
at age 94, 95 in one of the
Two
documentaries.
pictures.
You can see the background
Gentleman in
is
the
the
red
photo
tie.
of him when he's giving the opening statement. And he's still today, he's talking about the legacy of Nuremberg, or the legacy of what Justice Jackson was supposed to do. Even though he's 96, he can do 100 push-ups, and he's very much of a 21st century man. You go up benferenz.org. Do you see his last name at the bottom? And you can see his website, and you can see his opening statement and many, many articles and things that he talks about. I love seeing him speaking to students, but his motto is law, not war, that we need to use the law, the original dream of what Nuremberg started during that time.
Next slide.
Now, this is the
A gentleman
famous
with some
photo
police
of
officers. He's in like
Adolf
a cage or a
Eichmann,
box.
not mentioned in the book,
Glass
not a
box.
forgotten trial, who Eichmann was the person in the SS responsible for the murder of the Jews. And he came in 1944 to Hungary when during the beginning of 1944, German troops came in, and within a period of few months, he ended up taking the last remaining large Jewish population, about 400,000 Jews, and shipped them over to their deaths to Auschwitz, where 90% of them were murdered, and then a few had survived. And so Eichmann escaped to Argentina. He was captured by the Israeli Mossad in 1961. They could have just executed him, but they followed the Nuremberg precedent. They said, we just don't kill off bad guys, we put them on trial. So he was brought to Israel and Jerusalem. There he is in the glass booth to actually protect him. Dr. Servatius, who was one of the German lawyers, defense lawyers in Nuremberg, was the attorney who Eichmann asked for to come to Jerusalem to defend him. And the Israelis paid for Dr. Servatius to come and give him his best defense. He was tried for crimes against the Jewish people, which is nothing more than the crime of genocide, but specifically against one particular group. He was found guilty, and in 1962, he appealed his sentence to the Israeli Supreme Court. They affirmed his sentence. He was executed. His ashes were scattered over the Mediterranean, so he would have no final resting place, and there would be no place where neo-Nazis could come, and kind of bring back, the glory of the Nazi rule. So this happened in 1962. I now go back
Some gentleman
to
sitting
chapter 1 of my book, and
like in a
to
courtroom.
1943.
One
And this
woman
is the
dressed in a
most
uniform,
forgotten of all the
military
forgotten
uniform.
trials. I've talked to Holocaust historians, so I tell the story, and I said, what? And it's the first time the Nazis were tried in the courtroom. And it was the Russians that did that. In 1943, in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov, they took 4 nobodies, 3 low-level Germans, and a Russian collaborator, the gentleman that you see here, not in uniform, an SS sergeant, a military officer, another SS officer, and put them on trial for the crimes they had committed against what they called at that time the Soviet citizenry. They didn't talk about the Jews, but it was really the killing of the Jews. And by that time, what they did, because killing the Jews by the Einsatzgruppen was too cruel, not in the victims, but in the perpetrators. So they devised the second stage of killing, which is the using of gas vans, where they pump in carbon monoxide in order to go ahead and kill individuals. And this was what these individuals were involved in. That itself, method of murder, was also considered to be too cruel, again, on the perpetrators, because people were gasping. They had to open them up, and they'll see that. So by the time you get to Auschwitz, you then have the creation of these human slaughterhouses in German-occupied Poland, where you have individuals being sent and murdered, or some that are sent in order to have what's called, at that time, the extermination through work program, where minimum amount of calories, maximum amount of work, and then within a period of 2-3 months, these individuals would be either die out or be sent to the gas chambers. But in this particular trial, it took in 1943. It was a Soviet trial, but it was not a Stalinist war crimes trial because it was open to the public, to the international media. I found stories in Life magazine about this trial. I found the transcript of the trial being translated in English. There was a movie made that was shown kind of to the home front to kind of show that this is what we're going to do. So what I call this is judgment before Nuremberg. It was the first time that you had Nazis being put on trial. We didn't know that there was going to be Nuremberg, but these were the low-level people that were put on trial. All 4 were found guilty, and all were hanged.
Next slide.
Now, I don't know if you recognize
Looks like
this
a
gentleman.
colonel, German
This is
colonel or
not
something.
a picture from that time. This is from the movie Schindler's List, and the actor Ralph Fiennes, who plays the notorious Nazi commandant Amon Goth. This is
One
from the
guy's,
movie again,
up in a balcony
and
with
the
a gun
famous,
shooting.
infamous scene, because
2 pictures
most
there.
of these, almost all these commandants did not directly have blood on their hands. They were the death murderers. He was a person who killed with his own hands. You remember the famous scene where he had the high-powered rifle and just for target practice would shoot individuals? Well,
Next
here's
slide.
Amon Goth, okay, with his
gentleman with
rifle
no shirt on.
in his villa. And if you go
And a
outside of
gun.
Krakow, you can actually see where the villa is. And the crew will
Next
easily committed.
slide.
He was captured after the war,
It's 2
and he was
images
sent to
of a
Poland to put on
Goth
trial in
Amon.
Krakow. You can see that he lost a lot of weight, right? And there was even a part of humor that, in any of this thing, how horrible it is, because there was a concentration camp victim who testified against him, who by that time had become quite corpulent. And God said, I don't recognize you. And he says, the reason is because I have become as fat as you are, and you become as thin as I was when I was your victim. And so he was tried, he was found guilty, and he was hanged. If you look at the end of Schindler's List, you have the scene of the execution by hanging. Again, you can go on YouTube and you can see. He was quite a tall man. So when they put the noose on him, they had to do it 3 times because it wasn't long enough. And he was actually, the last time that it worked. So the Poles themselves, what they established like their own little Nuremberg during that time. And they had a number of trials of commandants and other individuals in Poland.
Next slide.
Now,
3 pictures.
second category
same
of
guy.
the sort of the most
there's
unknown
jail
of the
pictures
unknown
with
trials
jail
was the trials
clothing
of the
on.
individuals that the Germans had used in order in concentration camps to make sure that the system was working. The slang term for those individuals was the Italian word capo, K-A-P-O or C-A-P-O. Different stories for origin. Capo meaning like the head, okay? And these were individuals who were given privileges, more food, better quarters, in order to be able to guard these individuals. And these were both Jews and non-Jews. Jews could not supervise non-Jews, but non-Jewish capos could supervise the Jews. So this is one of those individuals. You can see just from the photo, he's a little more well-fed. Okay, he's in a striped uniform, but he is a prisoner in Auschwitz. So he's one of the capos.
Next slide.
This is another capo
Gentleman
that was
dressed
in another of the camp.
fur,
You see
heavy
the Jewish
coat.
star Judah that he has, but look at his coat. This is not what the prisoners that had to work out there, this is what they wore. But because he became a capo and he said, I'm going to do this, he ended up giving better food, better clothing. Well,
Next
here's
slide.
a photograph of a work
Photograph
detail
of
that's about to go
workers
out. And,
at a
prisoners
prison.
after the war or even during the war, they try to put what happened into some kind of form, visual form. So this is an actual painting or drawing that was made by a victim of a work detail. And you see the sign with the capo is about to go out in the camp. Look how the person worn.
Next
Now,
slide.
in order for them
Picture
to
of a man
remain
whipping a
capos,
man.
these individuals had to be cruel to the other prisoners. If they were not, what would happen? They would be taken away and someone else would be put as a capo. So this is again a drawing made by a prisoner, but a capo beating another prisoner over there because they were head of a cell block. And
Next
here's
image.
another one. Do you see that? Okay. Now,
It's
these were
next.
very, very cruel
So
situations.
this is a slide where
Now,
they're carrying
imagine
something,
this. I
rocks,
started off in 1945.
blue uniforms.
I want to put you in the land of Palestine in 1946, 47, and finally in the state of Israel in 1948. Imagine a summer scene in Tel Aviv actually happen. A nice summer day in Yarkon Park where people are out there sunning themselves. And all of a sudden, a woman named Gerta sees another woman named Rachel. And both of them were in Auschwitz or in Ravensbrück. But instead of greeting each other and hugging each other, one of the women starts hitting and pounding the other woman and hitting her. And then she tells her brother, "This is the cruel capo that did this to me." And the brother starts end up hitting that woman. These situations occurred in Israel, not on a daily basis, but a frequent enough basis, and they were shown in newspapers. So what happened is the Israeli Knesset parliament ended up passing a law called the Nazi and Nazi collaborators law in order to put on trial these individuals. And so these capo trials took place in Israel that started off after the war. Some went into the 1960s. They are the also forgotten trials, and in fact, the records of these trials have been sealed until more than 75 years, because these individuals, you can see that the kind of situations they were in, they were called choiceless choices. They were cruel, but at the same time, they were forced by the Germans to be cruel. And so until their children die out, these trials are not part of the public record. And in fact, when I wrote about this chapter, I was told by a number of people, "Michael, leave this alone. Don't talk about it." And I wanted to. It definitely fits within the forgotten trials. And so these trials happen. What's interesting is about that law is that Nazi collaborator law was the exact law that was used against Eichmann. Now, when they passed that law in 1950 in Israel, they didn't think that Eichmann was going to be hiding in Israel, right? I guess it would have been a great place for him to hide. Who would look for him there? But it was really for these collaborators. But then when he was captured in 61, that law was already there. And he was put on trial under that same law that originally was passed by the Israeli parliament to try Jews who collaborated with the Germans because they had to in order to save their lives. Now, fast forward,
Next slide.
I mentioned
It's a
about
sheet of paper with a little square
other
picture in the
collaborators.
left corner.
And in the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, you had local Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Poles, Ukrainians that ended up also collaborating. A number of those were Soviet POWs. I mentioned to you about that 3 million Soviet POWs were, perished in the war because the Germans did not consider the Geneva Convention to be applicable on the Eastern Front. So this gentleman, Ivan Demjanjuk, who was a Soviet soldier of the Red Army, was captured, and he volunteered to become an SS guard. And he was a guard at a camp called Sobibor. Sobibor was not like Auschwitz. You didn't come and then you were selected for work or to the gas chambers. Everybody went to the gas chambers. And he ended up being one of those guards. This is the identification card from him. You can see it's written in German, and then you have in Russian, because this was a car that was captured by the Russians. And Demjanjuk, Ivan Demjanjuk, eventually made it to the United States and in Cleveland. And he ended up working in a Cleveland auto plant for many years. And many, many years later, he was then exposed. And there were a series of trials that took place. If I had more time, I would tell you about the trials of Demjanjuk. But eventually, he was his citizenship was taken away twice, but after the second time he was taken away, he then was deported to Germany.
Next slide.
So you see here,
Gentleman in
this
a
is him from the
wheelchair.
card. This is
Same-
the same man.
Same man.
And he was tried in Germany, in Munich, for the crimes that occurred during that time. The problem was, at that time, because it was a death camp, there was no one to identify him. We had a few survivors who came and testified. I was at Sobibor, but no one could identify this gentleman. So what the Germans did now in the 25th century, they said, look, if you were a guard in Sobibor, we know, according to Holocaust historians, that every guard was involved in the murder process. So he was found guilty for the murder of the people during the time that he was there, or that were transported from the Netherlands, Jews, to Sobibor during that time. And he was found guilty. In 2011, he was given a 5-year sentence. He was 90 years old at the time. He filed an appeal. Because he was old, he was released to a nursing home, and while the appeal was pending, he then died at age 91. Okay? So this is the latest round of prosecutions.
Next
Now,
slide.
the Simon
Spot,
Wiesenthal Center.
Aber,
Simon
Nitsch,
Wiesenthal was a
Spa.
survivor, an Austrian survivor who was a Nazi hunter. There is a Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles that carries on his legacy. They have a program right now called Operation Last Chance. If you can read the German, it reads Spät, aber nicht zu spät. Late, but not too late. And the rest of the poster offers a 25,000 euro reward for anyone that gives information of someone who was involved in a killing process. This is why it's called Operation Last Chance. And what the German prosecutors have done is now have gone back and prosecuted other individuals after the Miamjuk. The last
slide.
prosecution that took
Two
place
images.
was of this gentleman, Oscar Groning. He was an SS guard. He was involved in Auschwitz, but prior to the war, he had a business degree and he was working at a bank. So when he was sent to Auschwitz, he claims that he was not involved in the killing process, that when the railroads came and the Jews who thought they were coming to be resettled and their possessions were taken, his job was to supervise the theft of all their possessions. So he was known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. And he ended up doing this, and then he was an SS man. He volunteered for the SS. Nobody was drafted into the SS. And then he ended up basically denazified after the war. Nothing happened to him. And this is the interesting part of the story of Mr. Groning, is that he exposed himself in the early 2000s because he's a stamp collector. And he ended up going to a stamp convention, and he ran into one of these Holocaust deniers who said, there was no 6 million murdered. There were no gas chambers. And he said, not true. I was there. I saw it. Okay? And so he went at cell and he exposed himself going on BBC, being interviewed by Spiegel. Okay? But look what happened. At that point, the German prosecutor said, aha! Okay? You were there. So they arrested him. They put him on trial in the northern city in Germany. And last year, he was convicted at age 94. He was not frail, enough not to, in good enough health. And he was found guilty and given a 4-year prison term. He's out. He's appealed. He has said that he feels that he is morally guilty, even though he says, I did not participate in any of the killings. I don't feel like I'm legally guilty, but he was found guilty for the murder of 300,000 individuals, because this was the number of people that were murdered in Auschwitz during the time that he was there. Not as a principal, but using criminal law as an accessory to these murders. So you see this is the latest round. And in fact, if you watch the news, they now have discovered, German prosecutors, a couple of other people, a woman who I think was a radio operator at Auschwitz, and someone else who was, I don't know, he was working in some part of what they call the killing process. They enabled the killing. And so those individuals are going to be put on trial. We're talking about 70 years after the war ended. Soon the survivors are going to die out, the perpetrators are going to die out, and this story will be ending. There'll be no one else to prosecute. And so we go ahead and continue
Next
with the
slide.
story.
Forgotten
What I hope by
trials of the
telling you about these
Holocaust.
forgotten trials, and addressing it to you and especially the students, that you continue with the legacy of Ben Ferencz, that to know that the law has a very important place to play, and that if we use international law, we can, like the tribunals that are existing today, take individuals who committed, no matter how high they are in office, that they are not immune and can be put on trial as common criminals. Thank you.
We're going to do some question and answers. Anyone with questions?
I'm just curious, those who were convicted, both at Nuremberg and some of the trials afterwards, where did they go to prison? Where did they serve their time, and what were the conditions
Right.
like in where they were?
There were
Thank you.
two main prisons. There was the Landsberg prisoner and the Spandau prison. And so those were where the individuals were put. There's, and I didn't mention about this, but the negative part of the story, which is this. The individuals who were not put to death, who were given prison sentences, none of them served out their terms. Because what happened is the start of the Cold War began. And we felt that West Germany was not going to be our ally. And what the West Germans then pressured the Americans to go ahead and to free those individuals. It was a large campaign that was going on. And the folks back home didn't care about it. So I mentioned Judge Christensen, who was there, and he participated in 2 trials. And the very last trial that he participated in was the High Command trial. That was the last one there. Imagine he's there and they're prosecuting these individuals, and you have these congressmen and senators coming by saying, shut this down, shut this down. Nobody wants to care about this anymore. So what happened is, because Germany was still occupied, General McCloy ended up pardoning a lot of these people. And they ended up, basically they got away with murder. I didn't find this, but someone found papers that one of the letters that Ben Ferencz wrote to Telford Taylor, who was his boss many years later, when they had one of these Christmas releases for these individuals. And he writes the letter in frustration. I quote in the book. But he ends the letter, because it's a Christmas time letter, he goes, frustration, he goes, Noel, Noel, what the hell?
Yes, I did. I was kind of curious, was there any kind of an issue or anything that happened, when the Soviets and the Germans made their pact to split Poland? Did the Russians have any kind of a recompense for that?
Is there I didn't hear the word recompense?
Well, were they ever prosecuted for that?
No. And this is one of the criticisms that's made against the Soviet participation in these trials. Because the Soviets also participated in an aggressive war, right? Okay, but but they were never put on trial for that. And so you can say, and this is the argument that's made against Nuremberg, that it was victor's justice, right? Let me tell you why I reject the argument, okay? Yes, the individuals who commit aggressive war need to be put on trial. But these individuals that were there and prosecuted in the main trial, they were being tried for their own acts. When someone is put on trial, they don't say, well, wait a second, you too committed those acts. Or judge, you may have someone in your family that did it. You look at the acts of those individuals and see whether those individuals committed those acts. So just because guilty people go free does not mean that the guilty ones that are put on trial and able to be tried should also go free. Practically, it was impossible to create a tribunal without the Russians. And because they also suffered so much. And they were part of the victors. They had to participate in that. So it's the best way I can answer the question.
Would you agree that compared to today, instantaneous communication, awareness about what's happening, 70 years earlier at the end of the war, essentially that was a show trial. Because I guess I'm skeptical. How could we have really known, beyond just the top criminals of the war? So I guess another one of my takeaways from tonight is that thousands of criminals got away with murder from World War II.
Say the last part. I just want to make sure I heard you right.
Well, thousands of criminals got away from for crimes against humanity, and there was no way that we could really know the extent of the crimes, and so I think, again, Nuremberg I see as just kind of a show trial.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I think the answer is this, that in the aftermath of any atrocity, any genocide, unfortunately, many, many of the perpetrators will get away from murder. I am sure that there are many perpetrators who committed genocide in Darfur, and in the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda that have not been put to trial. So that's just unfortunate part of that. With regard to the Nuremberg trial, I guess the response I would have is like, what were the choices, right? What do you do with these individuals? Do you just free them? Like Göring said, shake hands, now we go back and we become allies again? Or what lessons do you show to the world if you're doing that? And so I didn't read the entire Justice Jackson speech, but if you read it, you can see that he said that there is a reason, there's a lesson that we want to do. And in another part of the speech, and I hope I can quote this right, he uses the term the poison chalice, okay? And he says that we cannot try these people, right, without knowing that this poison chalice we need to put to our own lips. So the same standards that we are applying against these individuals, okay, later on could be applied against us. That's a whole other lecture we could talk about. But it was not just for that. And then in the next paragraph after the one I read, he talks about that international law is not just to try, and he uses the term little people, okay? It's really there to have force to try leaders, individuals who made the military decisions and made the political decisions to go to war and to conduct the war a certain way. So in my mind, maybe because I'm just as a lawyer, as a law professor, I glorify Nuremberg. And I can talk about hours and hours how wonderful it is. But at the same time, I understand. Let me add one last point. I'm a law professor, so I get to talk a lot, right? But it's this. From a lawyer's point of view, when we look at what these lawyers accomplished in that short period of time, it is amazing what they did. Just think about the O.J. Simpson trial. Everybody remembers that, right? Okay? How long that took, okay? And all the different, there they were in Nuremberg, a city under ruins, having thousands of documents that had to be translated, put together. And how they did it, I'm just amazed that they were able to do that. And that's why I glorify what these individuals did.
So I appreciate the philosophy. I'm an attorney also. But was the same kinds of principles applied to the Japanese? Because if not, this really is more or less a show trial. But if we took the lessons and applied it equally to the Japanese, then there is, to me, a sense of principle that we were following.
Yes. Well, I don't think these are forgotten trials. Maybe they're almost forgotten trials. But we did establish a tribunal in Tokyo for the Pacific Far East. And it was modeled upon the Nuremberg tribunals. And we were going to go ahead and try the high-ranking individuals. We did not. This was a political decision. We did not put Emperor Hirohito on trial. Okay? And we ended up taking Tojo, putting him on trial. We took General Yamashita. We put him on trial. And in fact, he appealed his conviction all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. historians looking at the Tokyo trials do not consider them to be legally as successful as the trials in Nuremberg. Part of the reason is the lawyers were not as adept. The judges, again, I'm giving my opinion, were also not as adept. They ended up in the Tokyo trials not to have, they had an Indian judge, they had judges from other victim countries. They took a lot longer, and they were not as efficient. But they did take the principles of international law and did apply them. So to an extent, it wasn't just the Germans. We also did put the Japanese on trial with immunity, obviously, for the emperor. Would be equivalent, let's say, of Hitler. Okay? But those are political reasons. That's not a judicial decision. That was a political decision.
You mentioned of the 21 people that were tried in the original Nuremberg trial, 3 of them were found not guilty. Can you comment a little on them? Who were they? Why
Sure.
were they found innocent?
Sure.
I wasn't aware of that.
Right. One was a minister of the economy. I don't have the names now in front of me. I could quickly look it up, but you could, you know. One was a Nazi youth leader. These were high-ranking Germans. And I'm trying to remember, the third was a person who was involved in the communications propaganda. And what the prosecutors did is, remember, they had a series of crimes. And so they would charge specific individuals with specific crimes. And what the judges found is that for these 3 individuals, for their particular crimes, the prosecution could not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not that the crimes did not occur, but it was these individuals that were responsible. Now, we assume, we don't know the deliberations, that the Soviets would have put every one of those guilty and all of them would have been in the firing squad. But they were not the majority. So the British, the American, and the French judges really looked at the evidence. And they didn't accept all the evidence. And so those individuals were found not guilty. Some of those, by the way, were tried later by the Germans themselves under the German legal system. And those were the later trials that occurred.
Michael, if I could do a follow-up on this. Jodl and Warlimont, not Warlimont, Keitel, were tried in Nuremberg, but they were military leaders.
Right.
Why weren't they tried in the 12 subsequent trials, in the military trial?
Well, I mean, Jodl and Keitel were considered to be high enough, that they wanted them to be part of the group of the 21 people that were going to put on a trial. Because if you look at that first scene, I can put it up right now, it's a courtroom, right? They only have so many seats. They decided if you're going to have a trial, you got to pick individuals. And so Jackson and the other prosecutors kind of decided to pick different individuals from the different from the different parts of the Nazi hierarchy. So they actually had an industrialist, Delderkrupp over there. They had from the military. They had political leaders. And those were the individuals they chose. Later in the subsequent trials, like the high command trial, you had the second level people that were tried. But the highest military people were Keitel, and Jodl were put, and trying to think of his name, the admiral who actually was the legal successor to Hitler, Donitz. Karl Donitz, was also put on trial. And in fact, Donitz was even given a prison term. So imagine he's the legal successor to Hitler, the head of state, and he's not found guilty. He's found guilty, but not given the ultimate sentence.
Yeah. If I could ask you, how many of the people in the audience had the course in World War II history from Harold Deutsch? Could you raise your hand? You see that following. I remember when I took his course, he was still corresponding with Warlimont. He would bring in letters that I just got a letter today from Warlimont. Here's what we were talking about.
Really?
And he had I remember at least one letter from Frau Jodl, still trying to redeem her husband. So
Right.
it was, when you took the Harold Deutsch lecture, it was really living history. Another question here.
You mentioned one time Argentina. Is there an estimated number of war criminals or high-ranking officials in the Nazi government who fled to Argentina? Did they search them out? Did they bring them back? What happened to them?
Yes, I want to recommend a really good book. It's actually out in paperback. It's called Eichmann Before Jerusalem. There was a famous, let me call it infamous book that was published with regard to the Eichmann trial called Eichmann in Jerusalem. That book was published by a German Jewish philosopher who fled Nazi Germany, Hannah Arendt. How many of you have heard of that book? How many of you have heard the term banality of evil? That was the term, because what happened is Arendt came, she was a philosopher. She was asked by the New Yorker magazine to report on the trial. She went to Jerusalem, and here's what she did. She didn't stay for the entire trial. She ended up staying for a few days. She came in with preconceived notions. So here she's looking at Eichmann, and she looks at him, and he doesn't look like a monster that everybody's showing that. So she said, this is, evil can be banal. That's a true statement. I agree with that, and other historians have said that. What she didn't realize, and I'll put it in the most basic terms, was that Eichmann was a great actor, okay? And he basically fooled, he didn't fool the judges, but he fooled Hannah Arendt, because he was not banality of evil. And what happened is that when he fled to Argentina, he ended up being part of this German, community over there, and he gave an interview to a neo-Nazi where he basically said, if I could have killed more Jews, I would have done this. And this Eichmann Before Jerusalem is the kind of the response to Hannah Arendt, because this particular German historian, Bettina Stagnet, she published her book in 2010 in German. It came out in 2014 in English, and now it's in paperback. And then she kind of, when you read the book, you kind of get this idea, like all these German Nazis running around in Argentina during that time, and most of them escaped justice. One of the people that was hanging around during that time was Mengele, the doctor, and they were looking for him. He was smarter than Eichmann, as that he kept a very low profile. And when he saw that there was a possibility that something could happen to him, he fled to Paraguay, and he was never captured. And years later, they determined that he died in a drowning accident. Yeah. But he was never captured.
One of the things with the trial that you talked about, it turned out that Hermann Göring is the star up on the stage. He also turns out to be a very formidable adversary and a bit frustrating, and in fact, Jackson needed some help with that. And I had a chance to talk with Justice Jackson many years ago, and I asked him,
You had a chance to talk to Justice?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, he spoke here in the Midwest, and I went to it, and we sat down afterwards.
Uh-huh.
And I asked him how frustrating was Göring, and all he would say was, very.
That's it? Thank you for that. I'm really glad to hear that. I'll use that.
Well, listen, we're going to end right now. I would like for you to look at your schedule. We're doing another program in February on the liberation of the concentration camps. John McManus will focus on 3, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We have a couple of liberators. In fact, there's 3 in the Twin Cities that went into Buchenwald. I don't know of any liberators, but is Mr. Wallman here this evening? Please see me. His father was part of the war crimes at Dachau. He was part of that war crimes group, so I'd like to see him. We'd like for your dad to come up from Iowa to be a part of that program. And we're working with the Jewish community. If any of you know people in Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, or Dachau as internees, we'd like to have them here at that program. Michael, thank you for coming to Minnesota again. Buy a book and come up and say hi. Thank you.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.